Well, here we are in a pub called the Scotia, and we were led here, I believe, by Christie Williamson, who's sitting to my right. Christie?
Yes.
Tell us about the Scotia.
So the Scotia, there's a sign outside the Scotia that says it's the oldest bar in Glasgow. There are a couple of, I think the old college bar further up on the high street has a better claim. But it's a very old bar. And upstairs there's a pool hall, which is an open till 3 a.m. So if you're stranded in Glasgow, you need to find a drink. In the early hours.
This Modpo video is almost a commercial recommendation.
Yeah. Upstairs at the Scotia, the tables are a bit wonky sometimes, but
we've been maybe we'll hear some of the people dropping the 8 ball.
I think we have.
It's been happening. So anyway, in case you didn't get that, this is Christie Williamson, a poet and a longtime Modpo friend, who is here. We are in Glasgow, Scotland. And I'm so glad that you are, in fact, hosting us. So thank you.
Thank you.
And Sophia DoRuse is here, came across the pond. And Laynie Browne, who is becoming more than just an honorary Modpoer.
Thank you.
Who's a regular at this
point.
So we're so happy to have you here, coming from New York, maybe via North Carolina, I don't know. And Laynie Browne, different spelling of Brown, although you're both. Well, you're from elsewhere. You're from around these parts, via the south of the U.S. You're from who knows where.
I'm a Los Angelino.
Yeah, before that, Eastern Europe.
Before I was born, yeah.
And I'm Al. Okay, so we are talking about a poem by Edwin Morgan, and we're going to do something we don't usually do, which is to put Christie on the spot to tell us a little bit about Morgan's role and place in Glasgow, which is important. I might add a few things. And then we're going to talk about a poem in which the speaker is difficult to identify. So we, for those watching this video who are reading this poem for the first time, you're going to see us struggle trying to identify the position being taken by the speaker, whether it's Morgan talking to James Macfarlan or Morgan inhabiting the voice of James Macfarlan. There's a little reference to Robert Burns in here. So we're going to work this through together. But let's say a little bit about Morgan, a Glaswegian.
Yeah.
And a poet laureate of this city.
Yes, he was a poet laureate of Glasgow, and after that he became the poet laureate of Scotland.
Of Scotland?
Yeah.
He wasn't the first, was he?
He was, yeah. He was.
Who can name a couple of poets who might as well have been poet laureates before that? Hugh McDermott, maybe?
Hugh McDermott, yeah. Norman McCaig. Could have been in.
And he's more of an Edinburgh guy, McCaig.
McCaig
right?
is Edinburgh,
yes.
Yeah. McCaig is profoundly Edinburgh.
Definitely. Edinburgh. He's all over Edinburgh, right?
Yeah.
But Morgan was a Glaswegian, and he taught for decades at the university here.
Yeah. He was a professor at the University of Glasgow for. I think after he finished his degree, then he
stayed on.
Yeah, joined the.
And he died in 2010, and I think he probably retired. Not much, maybe 2000.
Yeah. I think he retired from the university. Like he did have a fairly okay, must have had quite a long retirement from university. Yeah. But he was still publishing. I remember the Book of Lives was published when I was just starting to get involved and interested in poetry, and he was. I don't know if he was 90 at the time, or he turned 90 just after.
He lived to 90, born in 1920, died in 2010.
Yeah.
He was a conscientious objector in World War II.
Yeah. That
may or may not have had to do with anti-war, or he came out as late as 1990, and it may be as a gay man, he felt that being a CO in World War II would have been easier for him in terms of harassment. He was into formal poetic experiment, but our poem today is not experimental at the level of the line. He was identified with the Democratic left wing. He was influenced by the Beats, although this poem is not beat at all. So, is there anything else we need to say before we get started?
if we spoke about, I mean, well, we don't. I mean, we don't. I think we're okay. Like if we've spoken about the concrete stuff in
say
Brazil
that,
and
because
Hungary.
this is actually not typical.
Yeah, I mean, this is like the least concrete poem you could possibly imagine. But Eddie was involved in like concrete poetry, and he formed connections with poets in Brazil, in Hungary, and Russia, and really challenged.
So a young poet like you coming up would know him, know of him, go to readings, read his books.
Absolutely.
Great.
Absolutely.
Okay. So we're going to ask Christie to read this poem. It is titled James Macfarlan, and Macfarlan was a Scottish poet born in 1832 and died 1862, and lived as a peddler, so he was a sort of 19th century bohemian poet. Whether the poem is written to him or in his voice, we don't know. So here is Christie Williamson reading James Macfarlan by Edwin Morgan.
James Macfarlan. A man's a man for a' that. How does he know? Traipsing with his plough, the rural hero, swaggering down the lee rigs, talking to mice, sweating his sickly verses to entice lassies he'd never see again, strutting through the salons in his best breeches, rutting in a cloud of claret, buttonholing lord this, sweet-talking doctor that, bowling his wit down levies, bosoms, siller quakes. Do you think he's ever heard the groans and scraighs of city gutters, or marked the shapes that wrap fog and smoke about them as if they could hap homelessness or keep hunger at bay? What? Not heard or seen, but has he even thought how some and many and more than many survive or don't survive on factory floors, or thrive or fail to thrive by foundry fires, or try to find the words, sparks scatter and bolts fly, that's feeble to show the new age its dark face? The Cairn Ironworks, how he laughed at the place, made a joke of our misery, passed on to a window scratch his diamond trivia, and swan through country house and customs post, servile to the very gods from which he ought to resile. Liberty's a glorious feast, you said. Is that right? Wouldn't the poor rather have bread? Burns, man, I'm hard on you, I'm sorry for it. I think such poetry is dangerous, that's all. Poetry must pierce the filthy wall with cries that die on country ways. The glow of bonhomie will not let the future grow.
Laynie, let's start. You, and we'll go all the way around. What a reading, thank you. Yeah, you really brought that alive. I mean, the rest of us,
I didn't even know it rhymed until then.
we've been, on planes and trains and buses, having this poem in our voices, our American voices, and only now do we start to get it. So thank you. So starting with Laynie, and we go all the way around, just identify the characteristics of the poet who is being identified in the poem. We're not trying yet to figure out who the speaker is or what Morgan's point of view could be. We don't know that. But who is the poet? What kind of poet is being talked about?
This poet is drinking and carousing and socializing and not thinking about industrialization or workers' rights. He's just kind of la-di-da, making friends, drinking, carousing, cheerful.
Okay, good. Leanne, add to that?
He's also got a patron. He's in parlors, and he has a diamond ring that he scratches his initials on a window.
Which is pretty amazing. So he's really figured out how to be the poet. and get through it. Christie, you want to add to that? Who is this poet? What's going on with this poet?
Well, he's a rural poet, and this Liberty's a Glorious Feast is that's presumably his line. So he's got I think a I feel that in some ways it's quite hard on the poet to not comment on the Industrial Revolution if it hasn't actually happened during his lifetime.
Yeah. So this is a pastoral poet.
Yeah.
And the poet that's in the title, I mean the title has to be significant. The poet in the title, born in 1832, died young in 1862 at 30 years old, right? So he's a kind of non-industrial poet or a pre-industrial poet who managed to get through and still die young. Sophia?
Yeah, the poet of the title, he died of like tuberculosis, right?
Yeah.
He just didn't take care of himself.
Oh, okay.
I'm agreeing with you. He was a Bohemian poet who figured out how to put on airs, but he also wrote poems to mice, to a mouse, and the reference is
To a mouse.
To a Mouse by Robert Burns.
By Robert
and
Burns,
Burns gets directly addressed by the speaker who's pissed off, so we'll have to put that together later. Go ahead.
I think what I'm struggling with this poem because it feels like the attack might be too strong a word, but the offense being derived is like against someone who is like luxuriating in the opportunity to not worry about basic human needs such as hard labor and working in settings that are like unmanageable. Yeah, I think that's what the address is too.
Okay, Laynie, now round two. Now it's our job, because we read poems and want to understand the point of view here. Can we begin to try to assign the parts? The speaker, not necessarily Morgan, the speaker has a position, presumably against the poet we've just gone around to describe, right? How does that work out? Is it consistent? How are we going to start identifying the
There's
speakers?
a lot of layers that are hard to parse, but I mean, one way to read it is that Edwin Morgan is writing a critique of the poet James Macfarlan as being not serious enough, as being too frivolous, and in this he's invoking Robert Burns, drinking songs, particularly the line that Christie just said, "Liberty's a Glorious Feast," that's from Robert Burns' drinking song, and then the first line, "A man's a man," for that is also from a Burns song of that same title.
Robert
It's
Burns.
arguing for egalitarians as Republicans in the 18th century.
Okay, so your point of view is that the speaker, whether it's Morgan or not, that the speaker says that poetry must pierce the filthy wall unironically. The speaker feels that to be the case.
I think the speaker is making a unfavorable portrait of James Macfarlan.
And so poetry should be real. It should acknowledge industrial misery.
We can't just drink our way through.
Okay, so it's anti-bohemian,
Drinking.
you know,
a lot
the
about
poet
drinking.
Maudit, the poet who drinks himself to death at 30, which we've romanticized, and we shouldn't.
It's a bad idea.
Bad idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the way I read it was, I don't know a lot about James Macfarlan, but I thought he was, it's in a persona poem, and he's speaking as James Macfarlan, dissing Burns. That's the way the whole thing is about Burns in James Macfarlan's voice. Like,
Okay, now you really complicated it.
oh, that's what I thought you were talking about earlier.
But before the camera started rolling? Oh yeah, but people watching this don't know
okay,
that.
Sorry.
So you're actually
okay,
saying something
right.
different.
Yeah, I think that it's like, you know, that poet I who does persona poems of different voices. That's what I read it as. He's being in James Macfarlan's voice saying Burns is a reprobate and a bohemian, and he's got his diamond ring, and he's got patrons, and he's like drinking too much. And,
Okay,
he's
so
not helping the cause.
So you know, or seem to know, how we should take the person, the poet, who laughs at the Karen Ironworks and makes a joke of our misery, the speaker says.
Yeah.
So the speaker's identifying with the misery of the Karen Ironworks, which was a company that was at the forefront of the Industrial Revolution in Scotland, right? And actually made cannon, naval cannon. So this is an armaments factory. And this poet made a joke of the work that was being done in that ironworks. And you're saying that Morgan ironizes that complaint? It's hard.
Well, I don't know Burns enough to know he did that or not, but it seems like he's saying that Burns did that.
He's hard on
laughed,
Burns,
yeah,
and that's...
he laughed at this. Yeah, that's what I feel like he's saying, that Burns did that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Christie, help us out now. I mean, it's Burns man. I assume it means Burns man, but Burns man, you're not a Burns man.
I'm
You're a Burns man.
I love Burns. I love his poetry.
Yeah, and you're something of a pastoral. You're something of a pastoral Scottish poet.
Kind of. I mean, like, But
so where are we?
Yeah, but I also there is like famously Hugh McDermott in A Drunk Man Looks at the Thistle like attacks Burns for not even attacks Burns but attacks Burnsianism.
And you're on that side.
Definitely.
Right. And I just want to say
there is
footnote that we and Anna recorded a long 2-part discussion for ModPo of The Drunk Man Looks at the Thistle by Hugh McDermott. So I recommend that to everybody. Go ahead, I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. That's okay. So there is Burnsianism is damaging because it becomes a thing that that is like the poetry in Scottish culture, and that's like it's a casts a shadow over like
hard to believe.
People like Eddie Morgan.
It's hard to believe that Eddie Morgan would write a poem this late in his career, 1997 Carcanet book, right?
Sure.
Saying, I mean, the poet laureate basically saying that Burnsian poetry is dangerous. That's all. He can't be saying that, or is he?
Somebody's saying it.
Somebody's saying it. Okay, Sophia, who's saying it?
I'm having such a difficult time with this because...
Is it because the poem fails?
I don't know. Well, it's like I'm having a difficult time understanding like the biological information I've been given about the author. Like the Karen Ironworks provided munitions for both world wars, right? Before it turned into like dealing with plastic.
And he's a conscientious objector.
Exactly. So I'm having a difficult time understanding like calling...
Morgan is putting on a voice that he doesn't like against a poetry that he actually does like?
Yes, but like it's the poetry must pierce the filthy wall with cries that die on country ways. Like poetry
Iambic.
That pierces the filthy wall in iambic
Faustian.
pentameter?
Yeah. So is he winking at us saying, don't believe the speaker who writes a poem like this? Because this poem does not pierce the filthy wall.
No, it's not.
Oh. Why is Scottish poetry so difficult? Because it has to take these positions. I guess you're the one who has to answer this. I mean, Morgan, you said, wrote all kinds of different poetry. And this is, it's a pose of some kind.
Yeah.
What's at stake in Scottish poetry or Scottish poetry history that's being worked out here?
I mean, there's the idea of poetry is dangerous. I think if poetry is dangerous, then I think it's probably doing quite well. Actually, I think
that might be Morgan's point of view. Ironizing the speaker.
Yeah.
All right, we're going to go around for final thoughts on this poem that we have not figured out, except to say that Morgan is trying to write deliberately a poem that is itself dangerous in not doing the hard stuff. and that he's not piercing the filthy wall, and the iambic should be a wink saying it's not really Edwin Morgan taking that position. That might be my final thought, but you get to go now.
Okay. First, I want to say that I love Christie's statement equating danger as possibly a good thing. So danger in itself isn't good or bad. It depends is the answer right there. But regardless of the question marks that we still have, I think one thing that's really interesting about this poem is that it calls into question this age-old question about what is the job of the poet. Is it okay to be a pastoral peddler? Is it, or does every poet need to write about industrial revolution and weapons production, and or what are the ethics involved in being a poet, and what are the lives a poet can live? And a lot of these questions are being asked in the poem.
Leanne?
But yeah, I think it's important, the last line about the glow of bon ami will not let the future grow. That goes along with what Laynie's saying. I still don't know if it's like ironizing or not, but that's a very crucial kind of
It's certainly
statement, right?
politically correct.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, sorry to use that phrase,
Yeah.
but this poem is full of politically correct lines, proletarianism, expected leftism, anti-bohemianism. It's almost too good to be true
Right.
from that position.
Okay.
That's our evidence against it. So what would Morgan be doing if he's saying, don't trust that?
Don't trust that voice of James Macfarlan.
No, the anti-Macfarlan. Don't trust the anti-Macfarlan voice.
Don't trust the Burns.
Do you think he's ever heard the groans and scrays of city gutters? This poem itself has no such groans and no such scrays, whatever scray is.
Shriek?
There's no shriek. There's no. This is not a poem that shrieks. Therefore, we
Okay.
should not take it as sincere, because Morgan is completely in charge of making a case that he doesn't believe.
Okay.
Oh wow. You're gonna go last, Sophia.
Well, I honestly did not realize that it rhymed until Christie read it out loud. So I'm like kind of obsessed now with these rhymes, these close rhymes. It's like couplets, and I'm thinking about like the doubles of the James Macfarlan by Edwin Morgan, and how that's not a couplet, but they're paired. And then there's like a series of couplets and the differences in these aligned words, and it's making me think of like what it's saying about perspective amongst different poets, and how things can like be close enough to make sense, but they're actually like completely different words, completely different poems. That's what I'm thinking of.
Christie, you are not allowed to get a final word on this poem. I would like you to get a final word on the situation of the Scottish poet that has to deal, not necessarily your generation, but maybe Edwin Morgan's generation, Hugh McDermott's before that. Why are these issues real in Scotland? What are we? The issues that he's raising.
Yeah, sure.
You know, I mean, it seems like a very congenial poetry community, but actually there's a lot of antagonism, the role of the poet.
Yeah. I think I mean, part of it is to do with like a kind of Scottish political situation, like in its historical statelessness. And like let's not go there just now.
Except that the statelessness is partly about the English that it has to use. The only Scots here are the quotes. Everything else is rhymed. There's a couple of words, but it's rhymed English.
Yeah, it is. It's beautifully rhymed English, and actually, it was a real joy to read it, and get like an embodied experience of the brio and the flair that Morgan pours into it, and the rhythms and the rhymes. It's a absolutely really tight piece of writing, as you would expect from somebody of Morgan's stature. Yeah. Skill.
I'm going to throw in a final word that is going to be essentially not helpful.
Okay.
But I have a kind of, without knowing information, I have a kind of autobiographical reading. Here is a poet who's publishing in 1997, who dies in 2010 at the age of 90. So he is a superannuated, super important poet. And he chooses as the subject matter of one of his late poems a poet who died at 30. He's 90. This is a poet, Morgan, who's lived so long that he's written every sort of poetry and taking every sort of poetic position. And I think there's a little bit of sadness or maybe even guilt in writing about a poet who burned himself out at 30 in the 19th century.
Yeah.
And here's Morgan maybe overstayed his welcome. And I think he's thinking, where do I stand? What kind of poet am I? And can I put the scrays in my poems anymore? I'm not so sure. And on that down note, Sophia, thank you so much. Sophia, thank you so much. Laynie, Leanne, and Christie Williamson. We are here. Let's toast. Anybody who's got this is whiskey. We've been treated here. And Christie seems to have had all of this. Cheers. And even the cameraman is having a drink.